Before the mafia ruled New York, another symbol haunted the streets of Little Italy, a black hand, drawn in ink, delivered in a letter, left under a door in the middle of the night. The message was simple: pay or suffer. For immigrant families trying to build a new life in America, the threat was terrifying because it felt impossible to escape. The danger was not always a stranger in an alley. Sometimes it was a letter on the kitchen table. Sometimes it was a whisper from the old country. Sometimes it was a name no one dared say out loud. But one NYPD detective understood what was hiding behind the fear. His name was Joe Petrosino. He knew the language, he knew the streets, and he knew this was not ordinary crime. It was the beginning of something larger. His fight would start in New York, but it would end thousands of miles away, in Palermo, Sicily, where the cop the Black Hand feared would walk into a trap. At the turn of the 20th century, Little Italy was crowded, noisy, and alive. Tenements were packed with families. Pushcarts lined the streets. Workers came home beneath gas lamps. Church bells rang above narrow blocks where neighbors knew one another by name. For Italian immigrants, New York promised work, safety, and dignity. But criminals saw opportunity. The Black Hand preyed on shopkeepers, businessmen, and families who had worked for every dollar they owned. A threat could arrive without warning, a demand for money, a deadline, a warning that refusal could bring fire, bombs, kidnapping, or death. Many victims stayed silent, not because they were weak, because silence felt safer than becoming a target. That fear made the Black Hand powerful, and it made them difficult to police. Most NYPD officers did not speak Italian. They did not understand the dialects. They did not understand the customs. They could patrol the streets, but they could not always reach the people behind closed doors. To ordinary police, Little Italy was a maze. To Joe Petrosino, it was familiar ground. Joe Petrosino did not fit the old image of a New York police officer. He was short, Italian-born, tough, and easy to underestimate. That became his advantage. Petrosino had come to America as a boy. He understood immigrant life because he had lived it. He knew how fear moved through a neighborhood. He knew why victims hesitated, and he knew how criminals used old loyalties, family names, and silence as protection. When Petrosino joined the NYPD, Italian officers were rare. But he could do what many others could not. He could read the threatening letters, question victims in their own language, recognize aliases, and hear the lies hidden inside familiar words, and walk into places where other officers were seen as outsiders. To honest immigrants, Petrosino became proof that the law could protect them. To the men behind the Black Hand, he became something far more dangerous. He was one of their own, wearing the badge. The NYPD needed a new kind of police work. The Black Hand did not operate like common street crime. It hid behind fear. It used false names. It crossed neighborhoods, and it depended on victims staying quiet. So the department created a specialized unit of Italian-speaking detectives. They became known as the Italian Squad. Joe Petrosino became its most famous figure. The squad tracked extortion threats, watched suspects, protected victims, followed names, compared aliases, and looked for the organization behind the violence. They were not just asking who threw the bomb. They were asking who wrote the letter, who collected the money, who gave the order, who was connected to whom. That was what made the Italian Squad different. They were not only reacting to crime, they were learning the shape of the network, and the deeper Petrosino pushed, the clearer the pattern became. Some of the men terrorizing New York had histories that began long before they arrived in America. Petrosino understood that names mattered. A man could arrive in New York under one identity and leave another life behind in Italy, a criminal record, a violent reputation, a connection to men already operating in America. To most people, those old names were buried. To Petrosino, they were evidence. If he could connect criminals in New York to records in Italy, he could give the law a new weapon. Arrest was one option, deportation was another. That idea changed the investigation. The fight against the Black Hand could not stop at the streets of Little Italy. The trail ran across the Atlantic, through police files, old villages, Sicilian towns, and names hidden behind other names. Petrosino began looking past the crime scene and toward the larger system. The Black Hand was not just a threat in New York, it had roots, and Petrosino was determined to follow them. In 1909, Joe Petrosino traveled to Italy. His mission was to gather intelligence on criminals operating between Italy and New York. He wanted records, aliases, criminal histories, proof that could expose men hiding in America behind new identities. But the mission did not stay secret. News of his trip leaked. The wrong people learned that the famous NYPD detective was in Italy, and in Sicily, Petrosino was far from everything that had protected him. No Italian squad, no familiar precinct, no Little Italy streets he knew by heart. Just Palermo, old stone buildings, narrow streets, dark corners, and men who knew why he had come. For years, Petrosino had hunted the Black Hand in New York. Now he was walking into the world that helped create it. On March 12, 1909, Joe Petrosino went out into Palermo. He believed he was following a lead. He believed the mission could still succeed, but the trap had already been set. In Piazza Marina, the shadows closed around him. Thousands of miles from New York, the NYPD lieutenant who had taken on the Black Hand was assassinated. The killing sent shockwaves across the ocean. In New York, the news hit hard. The Black Hand had not just killed a police officer, it had killed Joe Petrosino, the detective who had stood between criminals and the immigrant families they preyed upon. His death was meant to send a warning, but it created something the killers could not control: a legend. The detective who had stood between criminals and the immigrant families they preyed upon. The man who had proved that the underworld could be investigated, that fear could be challenged, that silence could be broken. His death became more than a murder. It became a warning, but it also became a rallying cry. Petrosino was the only NYPD officer killed in the line of duty outside the United States, and his funeral in New York drew a massive public response, with accounts describing hundreds of thousands paying respects. Joe Petrosino did not end organized crime, but he saw what it was becoming: a network of names, money, fear, records, aliases, and connections that could reach across borders. The Italian squad was one of the NYPD's first answers to that new reality. It showed that organized crime required more than patrols and arrests. It required intelligence, language, trust, and detectives willing to follow the evidence wherever it led. Before Prohibition made gangsters famous, before the 5 families ruled the headlines, Joe Petrosino was already fighting the future of organized crime. The Black Hand wanted silence. Petrosino answered with a badge, and more than a century later, his name still stands for the moment the NYPD began its first real war against organized crime. Before the Mafia ruled Gotham, Joe Petrosino hunted the Black Hand. Anyways, we are the Gotham Police Files, watching the past so we can understand the present. And together, we keep police history reborn. I'll see you in the next chapter.